Good afternoon. And I will say it again for the people out in the atrium. Good afternoon. And because what I learned when I was a young pastor was that the best way to get people to listen is not to speak words, because words go into one part of the brain, but to catch people's attention with music, I will just do a spontaneous bit here. You can clap along if you like. This is the day that the Lord has made, that the Lord has made. Music is so rich, and I think one of the reasons God gave that gift to humanity and to the church is because music does, we know from scientists, enter the brain at a deep and profound level and touch us in ways that spoken words do not always reach. So once again, good afternoon. I am Kit Kleinhans, Dean of Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you for the annual Nelson W Trout Lectures in Preaching. I'm going to start with the most boring but necessary announcements. First, thank you all for your compliance with our campus COVID protocols. Masks are to be worn at all times inside the building and should be placed to cover both your nose and your mouth. Of course, we should know that because we've been almost 2 years into this by now, but it's good to be reminded. Second, if you need to use restrooms, you will find those by turning right when you leave this worship space, continuing down the hall past the info desk, and the restrooms are on the right in that hallway. And third, while we are not live streaming this event, we are recording Bishop Curry's presentations, and we expect to have them posted on the Trinity Lutheran Seminary at Capital University YouTube channel sometime on Monday. So when you're inspired by what you hear and you wish others could have been here to hear it, know that they'll be able to catch it in syndication on Monday. With those announcements out of the way, again, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the annual Nelson W Trout Lectures in Preaching, which honor the legacy of the Reverend Dr. Nelson Wesley Trout, a Trinity alumnus, a member of the Trinity faculty, and the first African American elected to serve as a Lutheran bishop. This event was launched in January 1991 with a concert by Grammy Award-winning jazz singer and Dr. Trout's niece, Nancy Wilson. Proceeds from that benefit concert were the initial funds used to establish an endowment to support this lecture series in Dr. Trout's name. Following that 1991 concert, the first Trout Lectures were held in 1992. And this year marks the 30th Trout Lectures. The only year we've missed was 2020, when the sudden onset of the global pandemic led to canceling the Trout event at the last minute. As you leave Gloria Dei later this afternoon, you'll see that on the wall to your left in the atrium is a portrait of Dr. Trout, and next to the portrait is a plaque with the names of all the previous Trout lecturers. Bishop Curry, you are in good company, and your name will be on that plaque soon. So who was Nelson W. Trout? Born in Columbus, Ohio, Nelson Wesley Trout graduated from Capital University and from what is now Trinity Lutheran Seminary. Ordained as a Lutheran pastor in 1952, he served congregations in Wisconsin, Alabama, and Los Angeles, California. In 1960, he became the Associate Youth Director for the American Lutheran Church. And in 1967, he became the National Church's Director for Urban Evangelism. He joined the Trinity faculty and served here until 1983, when he was elected Bishop of the South Pacific District of the American Lutheran Church. In the program for the 10th annual Nelson W. Trout Lectures, Dr. Trout's impact was described this way. As a Trinity professor, one of Dr. Trout's most popular classes was Preaching the Story. The lecture series named after him focuses on his powerful proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, while also continuing Dr. Trout's legacy of building bridges between communities in church and society. Dr. Trout was known for his courageous leadership that opened doors that might have seemed closed for African American students and others preparing for the Lutheran ministry. His interpretations of liberation theology were very meaningful for pastors and church leaders, and he served the community as a consistent and tireless advocate for dispossessed people. Dr. Trout was considered by many to be a voice of conscience to the Lutheran Church during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Another Trinity alumnus, Pastor Kenneth Wheeler, wrote of Dr. Trout, "He was instrumental in encouraging me to attend Trinity Seminary. I sat, as did many of us, as one of his students, but he became more than just a teacher. He was mentor, friend, and father for so many of us African Americans. He would sometimes, in his private moments, speak of the pain that he suffered and the slights. On one occasion, I remember him saying to us, 'I wish that I had had the courage that you guys have when I was your age.' My personal reflection and reaction then, as it is now, is that he was a man of immense courage. He walked with dignity and grace. He had an awesome intellectual capacity, and he challenged his students and he challenged the church to embrace a gospel that held the doing of justice as a necessary thing, not an option, but central to the understanding and living out the faith." Dr. Trout died in 1996. We are gathered here today and tomorrow, not only to honor his legacy, but to continue his work. I'm now going to invite the Reverend Dr. Kevin Dudley to the podium. Dr. Dudley will be introducing our speaker, Bishop Curry. And this may be the point for me to interject. We're all nicely wearing our masks, and I've thanked us for that. I did tell Bishop Curry he could take his off, because the rest of us have been traipsing back and forth at this same microphone, but once he's at the podium, it's his microphone. So I don't want you to think the bishop is disobeying the dean, or vice versa. Anyway, like Dr. Trout, Dr. Dudley is a Trinity alumnus who returned to the seminary as a member of the faculty. For many years as an affiliated faculty member, teaching a few courses for us each year, And since 2019, we have been so pleased to have him as a full-time faculty member whose teaching focuses on mission, church, and society. Dr. Dudley?
Thank you, Dean Kleinhans. It is truly a privilege and a pleasure to be able to introduce somebody who I think is one of the smartest people that I know. One of my prayers ongoingly is, God, put me in the pathway of people that I need to know, but also, God, let me be in the presence of people that are smarter than I am. And I met Bishop Curry more than a decade ago now, and during that time we were both kind of cutting our teeth on different expressions of ministry, and there were a number of things that struck me about him. And by the way, I won't read through his bio, you have that in your program, but my remarks are more personally oriented. But there are a couple things that I noticed about him and that stick with me even to this day. Beyond his vast experience, he's done a lot in the way of serving the church, but even more so serving the communities where churches have been planted. He's taken seriously the obligation and burden and privilege of mentoring persons who are coming along on the journey as well. But the first thing that struck me about him is that he's always been a man of conscience, and conscientiousness. Way before getting woke was popular, there were people who were already conscious of what was going on in our neighborhoods and our communities. And God has given him and gifted him a mind to be able to see what's truly going on in the world around us. The other thing that struck me about him is that being from Chicago, nonetheless, he's always been a courageous man. Not afraid to speak truth to power, not afraid to stand, not afraid to go where many people are not willing to go. And he's been that kind of leader. And so it was no surprise to me when God elevated him as bishop and called him into service at a greater level. I've watched so many leaders around the country, but my heart longs for more leaders like Bishop Curry, who truly have devoted themselves to the work of ministry and to the people in our communities. I presently teach a course right now on church and community and the Black experience, and as I was reflecting on the course and reflecting on Bishop Curry, he fits the model of everything that we're talking about in the course. What does it look like to wed together the work of the church with where people really and truly are living, and how the gospel of Jesus Christ might be working through both of those. So I am so pleased and so privileged and so proud to invite my dear brother, my friend, no longer a peer, God has raised you up, but my colleague in ministry, Bishop Yehiel Curry. Thank you.
It is an honor and privilege to be with you. I must be honest, I would have preferred to remain in the Metropolitan Chicago Synod, where I am bishop, than to be standing before you today. This is new, weird, and different. But in many ways, this invitation has brought a level of healing for me personally that I did not expect. I first want to begin by thanking Dean Kleinhans. We've got names that we've been practicing back and forth. Kevin Dudley, for the opportunity to honor the first African-American bishop, Lutheran bishop, the Capital University alumni and past faculty member of Trinity Seminary, Bishop Nelson Trout, with my presence. I was blessed to experience Dr. Cynthia Hale at the 2010 Nelson Trout Lectures. I returned in 2011 with 5 lay leaders to learn from some of your local pastors and from the Reverend Dr. Claudette Copeland. I provided a reflection on Reverend Dr. Otis Moss' book, Blue Note Preaching, during one of the 2016 breakout sessions. And last year, I participated in one of the panels for the African Descent Student and Leaders, facilitated by Reverend Dudley. So not only do I stand on the shoulders of Bishop Nelson Trout, I am thrilled to go from participant to presenter. I got to try and make sure this thing works. This is like totally not my style. Okay. I need to turn it on first? Okay. Oh, I see the on button. Let's see if it works now. My staff would be so proud. I come from a tradition that before you can begin, when an elder is present, you need to acknowledge. In my presentation, I will talk about an organization called SIMBA, Safe in My Brother's Arms. You need to know that I am in the Lutheran Church because of SIMBA. But you also need to know that SIMBA was basically thought up at St. Philip Lutheran Church here in Columbus. We know Pastor Hawkins is there now, but there were leaders here who raised up this organization, and as a result, there's 6 chapters now. And there's been one leader of that camp whose name is Dr. Lewis Dodley, who is here before us today, who's from Columbus, who's a local psychologist, and I want to acknowledge the elder whose presence is here today. COVID-19 has synods all over the ELCA, and denominations worldwide are scrambling to deal with rostered leader shortages, exacerbated by early retirements, a diminishing faith base, fewer seminarians discerning a call to ministry, clergy departures for other vocations, and an uncertain economy. And the ELCA, we've talked about this expected shortage for 20 years. In our document, Many Voices, Tell the Story, Create the Vision, Build Our Future, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America Plan of Action for Ministry in African Descent Communities, published in 2005. In that document, we were warned that 70% of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in American pastors of African descent would be at the age of retirement by the year of 2025. The report continues to suggest that if new models are not developed to address this leadership shortage, the ELCA will face a significant decline in communities of color and will miss its opportunity to join the work of God in creating the kingdom of heaven here on earth. The COVID epidemic is new, but this crisis of the church is not. I think the most helpful response to the crisis, one that will both help and transform us, can be found in the work we've already been doing, and in communities and congregations where we already have relationships. Excavating and reforming leadership from within the community examines the unlikely story of Shekinah Chapel Lutheran Church, an unintentional, unconventional African descent poverty ministry on the south side of Chicago, and the tools of the ELCA that helped in its success. We will also learn about other mission communities, excavating and reforming leadership within the Metropolitan Chicago Synod. And then we'll bear a little fruit. Over the next 2 days, our foundational scripture will be Luke, the 13th chapter, verses 6 to 9. Then he told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil?" He replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." In the parable, a fig tree is planted in a vineyard by the owner. Apparently, this was the 3rd consecutive year. The owner came looking for fruit the tree was supposed to produce but found none. Thinking that the investment in the fig tree is a loss, the owner suggests that the gardener cut it down. But the gardener intercedes for the tree. "Let's give it another year." The gardener wants to dig around the tree and fertilize it. "Let's give it another year" seems to be the COVID-19 anthem. Let's give it another year. The word for dig used here in the Greek is skapto. It means to dig or excavate for gardening purposes, to grow things. Sometimes you must dig in order to grow. So what does it mean to dig around the ELCA's diversity issues? What does it mean to dig around seminary education? What does it mean to dig around our ministries and our institutions? I suggest that sometimes when we dig, we excavate leaders who help us to grow. At Shekinah Chapel's organizational peak, which I think was about the year 2003, we were fruitful. We had a young, charismatic seminarian leader. Our average worship attendance was 150 people, and our average age was 25. African descent congregations, ELCA church-wide staff, young families, and young adults bought into the emergent worship style, which included poetry every Sunday, praise and worship, libations, liturgical dance, and the preached word. There was also a strong commitment to youth and service in the community. But that's not how it began. See if this image sounds familiar. 50 people died. 2,300 people injured. And countless homes and businesses were destroyed by fire. In 1992, after 4 policemen were acquitted of the beating of a motorist, Rodney King, in Los Angeles. A group of African descent leaders in the ELCA, digging around the pain that caused the riots, started a 2-week rites of passage camp experience for African American boys called Simba. Safe in my brother's arms. In 1993, 35 African descent elders, pastors, parents, seminarians, and youth arrived at the Mishawaka Lutheran camp to talk, listen, fellowship, and strategize at their first Simba camp. In 1994, that number grew to 70. In 1995, Simba launched a monthly worship service in Chicago called Shekinah Chapel. It was designed and organized by young adults who supported and attended the Simba camp after they realized that many of the children were not attending places of worship. The curriculum from camp was brought to the congregation. Camp curriculum was brought to the church. So instead of your weekly Bible study, we had potluck, free haircuts, sessions on conflict resolution, and trauma associated with violence and death. Shekinah Chapel as a worshiping community was designed to be an aftercare program for a camp. In 1997, Shekinah Chapel started weekly worship services on Sundays at 5 p.m. The worshiping community was no longer majority male. The 40 people who gathered on Sunday nights were young families, professionals, youth, the unchurched, those kicked out of the church, and those suffering from church hurt. This was also the year my family was introduced to Shekinah Chapel. We went to a worship service and joined, but I got to admit I was more interested in the camp because I was a 7th grade teacher at one of the poorest public schools in Chicago, Doolittle East Middle School, and the Ida B. Wells Housing Project. As a matter of fact, in 1999, I took 21 of my students to my first Simba camp and recruited 3 teachers as counselors who also became members of the ministry. Then in October 2005, about 10, 20 to 30-somethings lingered behind after the devastating meeting involving the same reason we all left the church in the first place. Church hurt. Our leader was leaving, and so was most of the members. 10 years of mentoring and ministry gone in an instant. We were hurt. We felt abandoned. We thought to ourselves, do we cut it down? But we decided to give it another year. My transition from educator to entrepreneur meant that I had a little bit more time, so they asked me if I would be the interim leader. I said yes. By the way, this new leadership preaching thing at Shekinah Chapel didn't come with a check. It didn't come with benefits. As a matter of fact, at that point in time in my life, I didn't know any preacher that got paid. This was for the free. The Great Commission found in Matthew 28:16 and 20 is often used as the principal biblical mandate for the Christian community. In verses 19 and 20, Jesus gives final instructions to the disciples. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. During my early days as a leader at Shekinah Chapel, the Great Commission was the name of our lay leadership development apprenticeship strategy. This was in response to a need for creativity regarding leadership development, understanding that we were a poverty ministry trying to utilize a team approach with no paid staff. Every time someone joins Shekinah Chapel, our Great Commission strategy encouraged new members to consider a ministry to accompany for the first year. These leaders were engaged, equipped, and empowered as they discerned their call to ministry as lay leaders. I tried to quit this church. They had engaged me in such a level when I first joined. I was in ministry and had built relationships. I spent all of my years as a Catholic. Catholic grammar school, Catholic high school, Catholic college. When I left college, I went to a Baptist church. I was good at quitting on denominations. But this was different. It was hard to quit on friends. This engagement strategy of soon as they came through the door, doing gift inventories and saying, here are the ministries. Which one will you accompany for a year? It worked for me, so we kept doing it. The most difficult time of the early ministries was this middle one, equipped. Because with ministry, you don't know what you don't know. I didn't know anyone in seminary. Ministry was a grassroots thing in our community. So I didn't know what I didn't know, so I modeled what I knew, which is what I learned from camp, which I learned from other communities and other congregations. But every time we got something, we brought it in and we did our best to equip the leaders. Without even knowing it, the engagement was digging around the ministry to find out who's there, who has what gifts. And the equipping, without even recognizing it, was the fertilizer, the manure to provide the energy to make the soil healthy. But the most important part was the empowering. Go ahead and stumble forward and get a bloody nose. Try it. Every time someone joined, you now had a group. You tried your ministry. You talked about it. We assessed it. It was action, then reflection. It was action first. Now let's talk about it and let's go try it again. Every ministry lead had an apprentice. Now this was as a necessity. When you go from 150 to 10, the whole ministry died. We had to build it all over again. I was never going to do that again. I need you to know that 3 daughters and I had a family and we had a house and I was barely making ends meet. So this apprenticeship model was a necessity for me to be able to live and to survive. Here's a view of what that ministry was like. When we started drilling down unconsciously, when we started digging around it, when we started excavating leaders, one of the ministries you joined was worship. Jason was 23 years old. He was a Baptist preaching prodigy, fell in love with a Lutheran young girl named Rahel, who now works at Churchwide. He saw poetry for the first time and said, I want to try that. Got up one Sunday and did it, then became what we call a Def Jam poet, where he's traveled the entire country doing poetry. My wife, LaShonda, was serious about education. We had 3 daughters, and one of the things I learned is that people who just gravitate to a ministry where it don't feel like work, you let them do it. You let them stumble forward. We had 3 daughters. She was serious about it. She was a teacher. I transitioned out. She transitioned in. Today, she's an assistant principal. That drilling down process may have never allowed her to lead in that way. I talked about Simba earlier, which was the anchor for our ministry. The ministry was started by a camp that was brought up as a result of a riot in another state. But I got daughters. People started coming. And one of the things we came to realize was that if you're going to have a Safe in My Brother's Arms camp, you're going to have a Safe in My Sister's Arms camp. Nation was the one who brought it to my attention, and her and my wife together founded this group, this youth organization for girls. Larry was a kid from 8 who started in the camp, who had grown up, so they together was leading this ministry. Irene showed up one week, and I could tell that she was expecting, and I prayed with her. And she said to me, you didn't judge me. You didn't ask whether or not I was married or who the father was. And as a result of that, I said, I'm going to make this my church. I'm going to be a member here. She happened to name that baby Shekinah. What better person to lead membership than to someone who felt like a member? Vanessa was a youth that we mentored, tracked all the way to Northern Illinois University, who decided that she wanted to help with the young adult ministry and the poetry ministry. Sebastian was a captain with the Chicago Fire Department. He came from the United Methodist Church, where he was an elder who did sick and shut-in work. Remember, he's a captain. I've tried, we both would get the message at the same time about somebody being in a hospital. I've never beat him there. This was a ministry that was near and dear to his heart. Natasha has a personal story. She's the facility director at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago that shares space with Lutheran School of Theology. All I could tell you is that every time a young black boy made it safely to church, she went up and hugged him. She stood at the front door. Those who wanted hugs had a hug every Sunday. Dig around it for a year. I want to quickly talk about this apprenticeship model because we talk about it a lot, but I didn't have a way to kind of, so every week we would say this weird saying that we got from a group called Intentional Impact. We would stand up every day and we would say, I do, you watch, we talk. We do, we talk. We do, I watch, we talk. You do, someone else watches, y'all talk. When you're doing that every week, pay attention to the children when it comes to this time. They were just having a ball with it. But what this was is a 3-month increment when you were new and you joined a ministry. The lead will do the work. And we will talk about it every time our ministry have an event. But you should expect somewhere after the 3-month period of time that I'm going to give some of those duties to you. I'm going to give some of those duties to someone else. We're going to do it together, then we're going to talk about it as a group. Then you're going to do it. And I'm just going to watch. Then we're going to talk about it. Then you're going to do it. And someone else is going to watch it. They're going to talk about it. I know this isn't popular, but this is how I run my staff. I understand that if I'm doing my job well, somebody's going to come knocking at the door and present one of my staff members with an amazing offer. And if we have no one there to pick up the pieces, we've got to start all over again. I only needed to go through it one time in life to develop an apprenticeship model that I want to bring forward every time ministry is at stake. So that's what we were doing, guys, before we even knew what it was about. I'll come to this in a second, but after about a year of doing that work, the bishop's office called. We had grown from a community of 10 to a community of 65. I had a meeting with Bishop Landau, who began to explain to me the polity of the ELCA. You need to understand at this point, we knew we were connected, but we didn't know how we were connected. At that meeting, I learned that from 1997 to 2005, when we had the schism, the Shekinah was actually a mission site called a synodically authorized worshiping community. We didn't know all of that. But he got my attention when he said that a SALC is a mission site that receives a small grant from the Synod and churchwide. Amen. You need to know for 2 years, we've done this work by ourselves with no compensation. But it's different now because now we're getting healthier as a SALC. And the way that SALCs are created, that once you start showing this growth, there's an opportunity to build something and grow something. And so what Bishop Landau said to me was that if we were doing this work so that Shekinah could become an organized congregation in the Metropolitan Chicago Synod and the ELCA, I would need to go to seminary. I would need to enter candidacy. You say this question to me 4 years sooner, it's no. But now I feel like I've been a part of something. I've built something, and you're telling me in order for it to go to the next level, here's what I got to do. So I thought about it. Do we cut the ELCA off? Or do we give it another year? we decided to give it another year. I got to be honest with you. While I would have done anything to save Shekinah Chapel, I was nervous. I had heard horror stories about when you go to seminary, they tell you, don't you go back to your church. You're being prepared for the wider church. I didn't know, how does this work? You're telling me I need to go, but I've heard, the first leader was from another state. I was nervous about what this might mean for this ministry that I was laboring with. I was also nervous because the primary model for recruiting and training leaders in the ELCA uses a method of traditional theological education, which in many cases precedes actual ministry. So go learn it first, then go get a job. I was raised up in a tradition that says practice first, then go learn, and come back and make it better. I was already doing ministry. And so I was curious about how what we were doing in the ELCA would come together. After I ended the candidacy process, I was recommended for a program called Theological Education for Emerging Ministries team. So that I know what I need to cover. How many of you are familiar with this program by a show of hands? Right? Thank you. Team is a process by which the ELCA approves for roster of ordained ministry those persons who because of age and prior experience are qualified to participate in an alternative program for preparation of ordination, which includes theological education and candidacy, but not necessarily the MDiv. I like to explain it this way. Ordination comes before the MDiv. That's the big thing. Whereas in the traditional track, ordination and MDiv is toward the end. In team, the ordination comes first because it says something is birthing right now. Something is happening right now. So we need an alternative method in order to care for what's happening. If you read the history of the ELCA, when the church bodies came together and they did the study that produced team, here were some of the recommendations. Team should have an indigenous leader who possess leadership abilities that are needed for underserved communities. Should have prior ministry experience and a passion for mission. Lay leadership who are already functioning as leaders. Those whose job, family situations make leaving the community to pursue an MDiv unlikely. Synods should have a place for these individuals to go. There should be a particular emerging ministry in its midst, while the candidate might be called to the ministry. The preparation prepares them for the whole church. If we pause for a second, look at COVID-19 and what it's done to our church and where everybody's fighting for leaders. I wanted to pause for a moment and say we've already done the work. We've done the work and we've identified a program that seems to be totally made for a moment of our time. I want to address this one thing that comes up over and over and again. Team seems like an easier, lesser route. I totally disagree with that. Education and ministry has to happen simultaneously, which creates a more significant burden for bivocational leaders. Team candidates are normally candidates like me who would have never considered seminary or an MDiv. So in many instances, the team program has assisted and diversifying the student population at seminaries. I entered the teen program in 2007. That's what I call check day. My theological review panel said I needed 6 courses. I did an 18-month internship and CPE. Was ordained in 2009. In 2012, Shekinah Chapel became an organized congregation of the Metropolitan Chicago Synod and the ELCA with 167 families. In 2013, I graduated from the Lutheran School of Theology with the Masters of Divinity. 2019, I was elected bishop. I'm glad we gave it another year. Let's look at some other examples before I conclude around the Metro Chicago Synod, where we have been able to dig around a ministry from the margin and find a team candidate. St. Paul Thai, a diverse, multicultural congregation that worships bilingually in English and Thai. From their existence, they've had a leader who's given them 15 hours to 20 hours a week. Anticipating the retirement of the long-serving bivocational pastor, part-time, we work with the pastor to lift up leaders from the community to succeed him, including a well-respected leader of the English-speaking community. The team program allowed David to continue to work full-time in the financial service industry, which has helped the sustainability of the ministry as well. David is married to someone who speaks Thai fluently, works in the financial service industry, felt a call to ministry. Had we not been digging through the congregation because this pastor was going to leave, and in case you're wondering, there weren't many pastors who speak Thai in the ELCA. Unidad. The true mission of Unidad was cemented when a lesbian couple reached out to a welcoming congregation in Berwyn to have a wedding. However, one of the partner's family members only spoke Spanish. The pastor spoke with Maria, a social worker, to create a beautiful bilingual liturgy. There were many LGBTQ plus Latinx folks in attendance, and the experience was life-changing. It was the first time for many of them to sit in a pew holding their partner's hand. Birthing a Latinx Lutheran mission with LGBTQ plus inclusion is the core of their DNA, and this was clear. The teen program took a social worker, Maria. An Anglo congregation gave birth to a Latinx ministry, allowed Maria to go and study before transitioning into full-time ministry. Rejoice. Rejoice is a unique context. It is a relatively young congregation started in 1993 that was planted in a planned community. They worshiped a lively contemporary worship band and are passionate about their intergenerational faith formation programming. When their longtime pastor retired and the financial instability of the planned community began to fail, this questioned their existing staffing model. We knew they needed to lift up an indigenous leader from their staff that could provide the best transitional leadership. They couldn't afford a pastor anymore. The pastor retired, but they had 3 other staff. One of those staff individuals were leading clearly each and every week. And we were able to take this lay leader who we learned had went to seminary and felt called to the MA route. But wanted to save the church and said, I'll do anything I need to do. Is now a team candidate due to be ordained next year. Mike knew what the congregation needed, how to meet their unique needs, and already has been helping them discern their mission and their direction. In closing, when we give things another year, we are working in God's time rather than Chronos' time. We work in faith, not knowing how things will work out, only that they will. Thus, giving another year is a theological notion for living faithfully within a structure that wants immediate answers and actions. Cut it down is a straightforward and gives immediate satisfaction. What does it mean when giving it another year? Means finally diversifying the ELCA and thus becoming the first step toward becoming something new. Thank you. Again, I demask with permission from the Dean. I again say thank you for the invitation. I reached out to Kevin a couple times to see if this event was still going to happen. And it was more about what was bubbling up inside of me than it had to do with being in person. The more I looked into what was happening with our church, with our world, I began to focus on how COVID-19 actually acted as a spotlight. I focused on, as bishops, how we were all wrestling with these retirements, but we knew we had 5 more years for. We were wrestling with emails that says if you have someone who's used to dealing with congregations of 500 to 1,000, where are your interim lists? There was movement. There was something bubbling underneath the surface, which had me going back to focus on communities like Shekinah Chapel. I felt like what was getting lost was the increasing number of communities that were going from full-time to part-time to a quarter-time. So while we were jostling for these positions, while the 20-something, 30-somethings, and the 40-somethings see this wonderful opportunity for congregations at the pay levels that they were hoping for, there's something else happening with ethnic-specific congregations. There's something else happening with communities that I refer to as ministries from the margins. There is a disinvestment in these communities by businesses and economies. And yet those are the places where the younger generation feels more alive. So the more I dig into that, the more these emotions about the community I had been leading, Shekinah Chapel, was bubbling up on the inside. And so I said to a staff person, Trinity's gonna make me write what I don't want to write. So I was one of those. I was one of those hoping for a delay. But I am so grateful in your persistence and your willingness to be here. I thank you again, Dean Klein-Hans, Kevin Dudley, for the opportunity to honor someone whose shoulders I stand on. And if you haven't looked at the plaque outside with Bishop Trout in the lectures, please do. It makes me nervous that my name might be up there with some of those awesome leaders. But I am truly grateful. I started yesterday with the premise that this spotlight that COVID has placed on us means that, we are in a time where we are going to have to do some things differently. I am not talking about our traditional theological educational route. My focus has not been in those contexts where we are healthy, where we are vibrant. My context has been to those where we need help and we are struggling. Before I continue on with the presentation, you'll remember that on yesterday, we spent some time learning about the story of the community Shekinah Chapel. This unintentional community that was started by a camp. How a camp started a ministry, a congregation. And we looked at one of the resources of our church in the ELCA called Team. And then we looked at other ministries within the Metropolitan Chicago Synod that I felt was excavating and reforming leaders from within the community. Before I moved to what I call an authorization program entitled SAM, Synodically Authorized Ministers, I first want to pause and see if there's anything from yesterday, for those of you who might have been with us yesterday, that was stirring. You guys have been great coming up to me after the presentation, after the sermon, with these wonderful questions. And my mind goes, I wish someone had asked it during the question and answer period. So there'll be another one later. But I'm just curious if there's anything that is bubbled up from yesterday that before I continue, if there's someone here who has a question that they want to lift up before we continue. I see one here. There's someone bringing a mic to you, just so you.
I began to wonder how your transition was handled.
when you left Shekinah to become the bishop?
Thank you for that question, Jocelyn. It's how I end today. And it is the most emotional part for me. It's where all the emotion from this comes from, because I'm trying to lift up that there are some of us who would do anything to save our ministries. And that the church has to be ready, because we don't talk like our call is to the entire church, because we don't know the entire church. We just know that corner of the world where our children's received education. And so because we have journeyed together, Jocelyn, I never said yes to let my name go forward because I thought I had a chance. I said yes to give Shekinah Chapel a chance. I said to my wife that if I say yes to this opportunity, more people will know Shekinah in a way that they don't know. And I thought that by doing that, because I knew that they could never afford another full-time pastor, that because I was raising half of my salary and $25,000 a year for camp, I was trying to lift up their exposure in a way, because I was feeling guilty, because in 2017, I said that I was leaving in 2019. And so, being an apprenticeship person who comes from the sales world, my heart was heavy because the person who I chose as an apprentice wasn't interested in the ELCA seminary. And so that turmoil from seeing your name go up. My council president was sitting 2 rows ahead of me, turned around and looked at me and said, "You said you would lose." My immediate thought, once I saw my name, was not about the church. It was about what was I going to say the next day at Shekinah Chapel. So my transition is where this emotion, where this excavating, where this apprenticeship model really comes into play. And so, Jocelyn, I hope to do a fairly decent job this morning in sharing what that looked like and feel like. And if I haven't, during the question and answer session later, I hope you would lift that up again. Thank you. Anyone else? What's bubbling up inside from yesterday? You guys are so courageous afterwards. Isn't it funny? It starts out this way. I didn't want to say this. All right, I'm going to give you one more opportunity before I begin. Anyone else with something that was covered yesterday that made you wonder? He's coming with the mic for me.
This is concerning the team program. Back 18 years ago when I came into the ministry, team was presented as the opportunity for people of color, people that were older, that needed to continue to live in the vocation and have an income for their life, but still be able to come up and serve the church. Now, 18 years later, I see more where I am in Northwest Ohio. I see team candidates that are young, that are white, that are anything other than what the program originally presented. And so my question is, where is the church really in that configuration of team. I know it probably depends on what synod you're in, and that bishops are making it up as they go along. That's kind of what I've noticed. But is there a general church-wide understanding of what the team program is formulated for, who it's formulated for?
Thank you for your question. I think I would answer it this way, that these policies that we have within the ELCA might be executed differently depending on the synod, right? So the more rural a community is, the more likelihood that there will be more of a diverse team population versus one that perhaps is more urban. But you are correct that at its core in the beginning, team was a mechanism that the diversity for those of us who operate on the margins could come into the church because there was this pressing need. There were these communities and we didn't have leaders. But whether it is Montana or Kansas or in central Illinois where it is very rural, we are seeing more and more team candidates that are white, that are younger. Initially, team was seen as someone didn't have the time, right? They did not have the time to commit to this longer process. Team has evolved in a sense where that age limit that they used to say for leaders of 40, had they kept that age limit, I wouldn't be here. And so what has happened is bishops have been able to make the case to church-wide, because there's still a collaboration there. Candidates themselves can't just say, I want to be team. I think what gets missed is you first start with a location. There has to be a vineyard that needs digging. We have to start there, type it up, and say, look, because of what's going on here, it could be a discipline matter, it could be a communal matter, economic matter. What is the best candidate for this community? And I think what we are realizing is a tool that was primarily used for the communities of color, and this is just being very clear, a program that many people put an asterisk by. You're ordained, but you came that route. What you're speaking towards now is a wider acceptance that we could have been wrong. Let's remove the asterisk. Let's broaden it. This is something that is doing a great service for this church. So that's how I might respond. The focus is still there, but I think we realize that this is an amazing tool, and more communities have utilized the team program. Again, I'm not talking about the traditional route. I'm talking about people who would never be in this church had it not been for the program. Thank you for your question. Anyone else? Bubbling up from yesterday. All right. Well, thank you for your questions. I'm going to try and I want to remind you that team is a program that in many cases take 2 to 4 years. I was giving 6 courses. I could only take 1 course a semester because I had this growing ministry. In some cases, there is payment, but in most cases for our team candidates in Metro Chicago, the average payment for one of our team candidates is about $2,000 a month. They are bivocational. So this isn't some way today. right, to just do ministry exclusively. If it's a new location, a new start, that's different. But what happens if it's an existing ministry that has unique circumstances? And when I say unique circumstances, sometimes communities change from white to black, right? Latinx, a different group move in, there's abandonment, there's flight. So in some of those cases, we've had a Lutheran witness for a very long time. So now do we not have a Lutheran witness because the community's changing? That involves some innovation. And in many cases, the leaders we are selecting are not saying, I'm in this full time. There's also a complication with funding. We typically are very good at funding new things. It's a little bit more difficult to say this church has been here 100 years. There's different leaders here. There's a different community here. How do we give it a reboot? That's that whole church vitality piece, right? So that's what's at its core. So team is a process. It's a program. At some point in time during this team process, a decision has to be made by the bishop's office. How do we celebrate communion? And when? I don't know what that nodding means, but I'm feeling you. You just won't ask no questions. Right? But these are the major. So at what point does baptism take place? Who do I call if someone dies? Can I do a wedding? So there is an authorization that happens in the traditional setting at our ordination. But what happens when you're called into a community today? Someone died yesterday. Typically, we have to bring in a rostered leader. And when the numbers are thinning out, more and more often we have fewer and fewer rostered leaders who can cover a community. So one of the tools that bishops have to be able to deal with this issue is what we call a synodically authorized minister, where this authorization that normally happens at your ordination, that authorization can happen after a process in the bishop's office with a particular community a lot sooner at the front end. I don't want you to be confused with the team process versus the authorization. Every team candidate at some point gets authorized to be a synodically authorized minister. So as I go forward, I want to make that distinction because sometimes people confuse the two. One is a track, the team track to ordination. Authorization doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be ordained. All right? Kind of keep that in your mind as we're moving forward, and I think that'll help us to be able to proceed. This has been our scripture, and I'd just like to read it again as we conclude our service on today. Then he told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I've come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting soil?" He replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." What is a synodically authorized minister program? The ELCA recognizes that at particular congregations, there are situations whereby they find it impossible to support the ministry of a full-time or part-time ordained pastor because of geography or economics. Thus, the church provides training and approves synodically authorized ministers. I want to say this again. This is not about doing away with theological education. This is not about some shortcut. This is about an existing community that cannot afford a full-time or part-time pastor, but somehow is really viable in the community. There's a presence. So what do we do about it? And the ELCA created this SAM program. In most instances, these persons will already be members of the congregation. But they also may be persons residing in areas adjacent to the community where the ministry is conducted. In either case, however, synodically authorized ministers serve at the request of the bishop and are under the supervision of an ordained pastor. In the Metropolitan Chicago Synod, our companion synod is the Central Diocese in South Africa, the Lutheran Church of South Africa. I went to visit with other pastors in 2017 during my sabbatical. This church is growing. 11 different languages. But I was shocked to learn that the language that they use is circuit, and we use synod or conference. In a circuit, there might be 5 preaching points. One pastor. At each of the 4 other preaching points are leaders raised up from the community who are either in seminary. They have a term that they call evangelists, or they are evangelists. Their job is to go get the people and bring them in so the pastor can do the work. I wanted to study what was happening in South Africa. How is this church growing with so few pastors? And what was happening is those 4 leaders meet with everyone else in the circuit who are like them and the trained pastors, and they get their assignments, they get their trainings, they report in, they're doing this work. But unlike the program we described, is the pastor rotates. And when the pastor shows up is when you get your communion. It's when your baptism happens. It's when the confirmation happens. So I know we are a society that wants everything right now. We're able to text something and get a response. We're able to order food and it show up at our door. We can get a ride to the airport, and if it's late, we complain. But when I traveled to the Central Diocese, if you want communion on this Sunday, you're trying to figure out, am I going to drive the 2 hours to where the pastor is? So they figured out this action response method where there are people in the community doing the work under the supervision of a trained pastor. And that pastor rotates each location. Of course, if there's emergency, they go different places and they do different things, and they have a dean program where the dean can come in and help out if there are problems. But that system exists in other Lutheran bodies, and it is working really well. I want to be honest and just name this, that not all synods utilize the SAM designation, nor do they have to. In some synods, there could be retired pastors, 200 of them. Amen. You know, there's some places where pastors like to go and retire. Warmer weather, right? So there's some synods that have a plethora of retired pastors who say, call me, put me in, coach, tell me what I need to do. But then there are others that don't have that luxury. How this program is implemented will also differ from synod to synod. I want to share some things with you about, after I did my examination, things that we put in place at the Metropolitan Chicago Synod. This is not a requirement, but for a synodically authorized minister in the Metropolitan Chicago Synod, you have to go through the entrance process as a way of systematizing who we have. And for those of you who may not be with the Lutheran Church, this entrance process is consider it an application to say, I want to be part of the ministry. I want to be a minister. And so the application, the psychological, that whole part, everyone has to do. But that's the only requirement for a SAM minister in the Metropolitan Chicago Synod. The reason we do this is because I was finding leaders in other places throughout the church that would say, yeah, I'm a SAM person. I'm a SAM, I'm a this. And there was no system to it. So in order for our synod to recognize how many SAMs do we have and where are they have to go through this process of being entrants. This is just a caveat. I want you to hear me. Because we do this, we only have 3 SAMs in our synod right now that are not team. I'll go through that later. But you need to know that because we have them entrants, 2 of them are on the ordination track and didn't plan on it. I've learned that when you send them through the process and you say something like, well, you know, if you go and try a class and you pass, it like counts. So for us, we've received a lot of benefit by saying everyone, regardless of your track, goes through the same initial process. Our synod programs spans 1 year. I'll talk about it. It's an annual renewable authorization. They all expire December 31st. So I have a bunch of leaders calling like, did I get selected? Have a follow through with the program? Am I being reauthorized? Those 4 touch points span a year. They include foundational workshop, modules, and retreats. Always have assigned reading. The education process for SAM is led by the Synod. Team is a seminary process. If you're in team, you might not necessarily need to participate in the synod educational process. I want to make this distinction because you will find leaders who say I'm SAM or I'm in team, and you need to understand that there are different moving pieces for how you excavate leaders. Our synod-led process includes this curriculum: Bible, Lutheran theology, Lutheran polity, in the confessions, worship, spiritual discernment and formation, leadership expectation, contextual understanding, business management, skill development, conflict resolution, coaching, and competencies. My staff develop a curriculum. We pick which 4 we're covering in a year, and we go hard. Typically, it's a retreat, it's a 1 day, And we make sure we cover these things, and we're always in communication with our seminary. If there are different things going on that we could take an instructor and have them lead it, we'll utilize that. But this is our way of making sure that the education that we're responsible for in a SAM authorization program, that we're covering it. Write your questions down. I see some of your faces. Write them down at the end. Here's some responsibilities. Congregations pay a stipend to our SAMs that the Synod office approves. So we don't allow congregations to say, this leader looks like $50 a week. We standardize it. We understand that the community is struggling, and our job is to try and get back to vitality. So we sit down and we go through the numbers. We work out what's acceptable. 5 to 10 hours a week, here's the amount, we agree, and that's what the congregation is doing. The congregations are expected to provide provision for authorized ministers to participate in a regular program for continuing education. So if there's something that we think could add value to our SAMs, it could be a conference somewhere. It is our expectation that the same way continuing ed dollars are provided for ordained leaders, that on a smaller scale, that some dollars are made available for our SAM leaders to get better. Accountability and supervision for synodically authorized ministers working in a congregational setting will be the direct responsibility of the church council or synod staff. In some cases, they're so small they don't have a council. My staff, which are assigned to conferences, then act as the supervisor for the SAM person. Remember, we only have 3 right now that are not involved in a team process. So we're talking about 3 of our 170 congregations have a SAM leader. All right? Placement and authorization. The authorization and placement of candidates for service within the Synod is the responsibility of the office of the bishop. What great way to not be a SAM is to come and ask for it. I've learned that in those cases, they're probably not the right person. My granddad used to be the pastor here, and, we've contributed all this money, or this has happened. I should be the SAM for this location, Bishop. I need your authorization. Just from my experience, these are typically organic processes where it's clear who the leader of the community is. It can be a service to the larger Synod that we discern this process and lift up a SAM. SAMs are not ordained leaders. We call them ministers. When you complete your program or our requirements, you're recognized as a synodically authorized minister who is able to offer pastoral services such as preaching, teaching, performing the sacraments of baptism and communion, doing weddings and funerals at your synodically authorized ministry site. I have to pause now and go back to team. Yehiel Curry was in the team program. From 2005 to 2007, I was not authorized. As a matter of fact, they didn't know I was there. I didn't do any baptisms or communion. There were certain things that were natural because of the community, funerals and things of that matter. But if there was a wedding, there was a person from the Synod staff who would accompany me, and we do it together. After I was accepted into the teen program, I was referred to as Synodically Authorized Minister Yehiel Curry. So I want you to see how the program works. That once you're accepted into the teen program, you're typically authorized. Rare occasions, there are SAMs who are not in the teen program. We only have 3. I want to remind you. All right? So sometimes that can be confusing. But for us, every teen candidate is a SAM. Am I making sense? The SAM program coordinator, which is typically through the Synod staff, and the mentor will evaluate the progress each year and make a recommendation on whether or not this certification will be renewed. Talked about it a lot. These are programs. You see why some synods use it and some don't. Maybe I can give you a visual, as I did yesterday, on how we've used it in 2 of the 3 situations. Lutheran Church of the Cross in Arlington Heights. After years of conflict and neglect in the dwindling congregation, we connected a longtime member who was discerning a call to ministry to strengthen her work as a leader of their social ministry program. During the pandemic, Catherine started sending out daily devotions because they couldn't get a pastor to show up on Sunday and no one else was doing it. The church doubled down on their food pantry efforts. Their Black Lives Matter sign was vandalized, and Catherine planned a public demonstration on the lawn. It was clear that Catherine was already leading them. Naming her as a synodically authorized minister allowed for some reprieve of the stress of finding weekly pulpit supply and strengthened Catherine's passion and sense of call. This is one of the rare cases where I was there when the Black Lives Matter sign was vandalized. I want to point out that this is an all-white community. The people that showed up to the demonstration were all white. They put the Black Lives Matter sign back up. I took a tour of the church and I saw this food pantry about the size of this room. But this is one of the communities that was worshiping 8 to 10 people, and it was hard to get leaders. They couldn't afford them. But then out of the corner of my eye, there was Catherine directing this and directing that, and was outside. I asked my staff, who is this person? Oh, Catherine, she's been here forever. I was more fixated on Catherine than I was on what was happening outside. I asked to meet with Catherine. And I asked her, why do you do what you do? Catherine reminded me of me, willing to do whatever she could to save that ministry. When the bishop calls you in, your mind always goes, they're about to close the church. She came with her information on why the church needs to stay open. The work they were doing. Small worshiping community. Large impact. got a collaborative learning project with Holy Trinity and Elgin. And when we use that term, it means that it's connected through a seminary, by which the church is the classroom. On a lifelong journey of discernment, Andrea had already become a deaconess, but with the Lutheran Deaconess Association out of Valparaiso, Indiana, not our program, and serving as a ministry associate. So she was just assisting in this community. But now feeling the tug to pastoral leadership. After a recent pastoral transition, this action reflection model of collaborative learning was implemented. Pastor left, community in turmoil, can't agree on who to come, trying to decide if we should open, should we close. A local pastor said, this person has gifts. I heard about this collaborative learning program. It's not the Lutheran School of Theology of Chicago in your backyard, Bishop Curry, but I'd like to be able to see if I could mentor this leader through their program and see if we could save this community. This is one of those SAM situations that's on a MDiv ordination track. What does it mean to bear fruit? What does it mean to bear fruit for a poverty ministry that will never, ever be able to afford a full-time pastor? What does it mean to bear fruit for an ethnic-specific ministry where English is the second language? And the food pantry is all we'll ever have. Some says bearing fruit is leaving a legacy of money. Money makes you more of what you are. So if you were bad with money and you get $1 million, you just still bad. I think bearing fruit means that you produce more people to help with the digging. Shekinah Chapel, this ministry with 10 people, cut it off. Let it die. And we decided to give it another year. We've had a total of 6 African descent leaders from the small community Seminary. It's a mixed bag, because it's that word try that's throwing you off. Because when you go to seminary and you're the only one, and you don't understand the church, you're dealing with pressures that others don't even know exist. So you go and try a class and you say, I don't know what this is, but it's not the community that I'm trying to help. We've got 2 that look like they're going to stay. Because we're talking about excavating leaders, the first one I want to talk about is Stephen Stiles. I have permission to use his information. Stephen Stiles was the drummer from the Holiness Church. Who joined us 20 years ago as a young person who enjoyed the 5 p.m. worship service and had all of these theological questions, wanted to argue about the rapture and stuff like that. He was just that person. He was from the hotel industry, so the spirit of hospitality ended up leading the youth. So he's responsible for a period of time with the youth curriculum. LSTC, Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, came to our congregation one time and talked about seminary sampler. He went to 3 seminary samplers. Just like to go. And they said, you know, you could try a class. That was 3 years ago. And he's still there. The one on the right was a Yagam. Did her ministry in Rwanda. Steve is active with the Simba program, Safe in My Brother's Arms. Shemaiah was one of the first SIMSA attendees, Safe in My Sister's Arms. When Barack Obama was president, she was an intern, moved to North Carolina, that's where she went to school, and was a 5th grade teacher for 5 years. Abruptly decided to quit her job. This is my daughter. Was driving her to the airport, and she was crying, and I said, "What's wrong? What's going on, Shemaiah?" She said, "Daddy, I'm going to seminary." I cried too. I know what it's going to be like, but yeah. But both of them are in the traditional. How is that going to help? This is why this bearing fruit thing is important. They're off to help the wider church. What about that community? Shekinah Chapel. You're now bishop. How does this help the church? How does this help you? I know this helps the wider church. This is Jason, the poet, the Baptist minister at 21, who was dating a young lady named Rahel, who now works at Churchwide. Rahel is 3rd generation Lutheran from Tanzania. This guy, Jason, is where that emotion comes in at. This whole presentation over the last couple of days is about not discovering me, but discovering Jason. In 2007, the only way I would say yes to being the mission developer is if we embarked on this apprenticeship model. I announced Jason in 2007 as my apprentice. I do, you watch, we talk. We do, we talk. You do, I watch, we talk. You do, someone else watches, and y'all talk. 2017, after sabbatical, I announced to Shekinah Chapel that I was leaving. I could no longer afford to be their pastor. 3 daughters in college, $100,000 in Parent Plus loans. I had not made Senate guidelines since 2012. I started at $50,000 a year, and in 2017, I was making $50,000 a year. Benefits, we got rid of health care in 2013. My wife was a teacher, so that's how we had coverage. Around 2014, I was raising half of my salary. It was my responsibility, because the camp founded us, to also raise $25,000 a year so that kids could go to camp. Ministries from the margins is so rewarding, but it's also so exhausting. I had reached my max. But I believed in a replacement theory. If you've bought from Amway or Tupperware, Primerica or Mary Kay, Herbalife, all of them believe in the replacement theory. Some of our new denominations that have this campus mentality believe in replacement theory. Replacement theory says that as you lead and develop your team, before you get your franchise, you have to first replace yourself. You can't go until you replace yourself. So I thought I was a failure, because Jason loves his job and refused to even consider seminary. 2017 to 2019, nothing changed. I allowed my name to go forward, thinking that the DEM position was in my future, thinking that I would work at church-wide or somewhere else. And when my name flashed on the screen, my wife was there. We looked and we embraced one another. That lonely walk from the back of the room to the front. I thought nothing but the community I was leaving behind, Shekinah Chapel. They gave me a couple words after I was elected, and I said these words knowing that Jason refused to go. I said, if I've done my work well, there's another Yehiel Curry in the pew at Shekinah Chapel. He called me. He called me a couple hours later. And he said, Pastor, I'm proud of you. And his next words were, I'm ready. That was the release I needed. I could not go and serve the larger church if it meant I failed my first assignment. My youngest daughter's name is Shekinah. She's 23 years old. That's how long I had been in that community. When I was elected, I would get these calls because people had learned so much about Shekinah and our impact, and they would say, you know, when is the RMP coming out? The MSP coming out. When will they be hiring? And I would say, pays about $2,000 a month. No benefits. The only way this ministry survives is an indigenous leader who loves it the way I did, rises up and become the replacement. Too often our focus is on our well-established congregations with new structures and new fixtures, 3 and 4 pastors. But the majority are dealing with half-time pastors. I'm so glad we gave it another year. When we give things another year, we are working in God's time rather than Chronos time. We work in faith, not knowing how things will work out. Only that they will. Thus, giving another year is a theological notion for living faithfully within a structure that wants immediate answers and actions. Cut it down. Is a straightforward and gives immediate satisfaction. What does it mean when giving it another year means finally diversifying the ELCA and thus becoming the first step in becoming something new? You'll notice that by Jason's name is the ELCA Fund for Leaders, something I never even achieved. Not only is he serving as a team candidate, but he's one of our Fund for Leaders. Let's give it another year. Thank you. All right. Here's your opportunity. All right, I see one already.
Thank you very much, Bishop Curry. I'm Cynthia Holder-Rich. I serve here in an administrative role. We taught at Tumani University Macamira for 4 years, and we know Rahel quite well.
Okay.
Because she comes out there. And I did my PhD in South Africa. So I want to ask a question that comes out of my experience teaching at a seminary of the Reformed Church in America, where they developed an alternative track for theological education. And some of the people who were very involved in developing that alternative track have now led 43 churches out of the denomination who do not want to ordain women. Some of them don't want to ordain women, but they certainly don't want to have anything to do with LGBTQ people. And in Tanzania and also in South Africa, there is another Lutheran body that's very active. There is a battle going on for what does it mean to be Lutheran. Okay, I'm Presbyterian, so my Lutheran husband said, you can say Missouri Synod. It is the Missouri Synod that's very active in Tanzania and very, very active in South Africa. And as a woman clergy, in our mission service in Tanzania and in Madagascar, where the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is also very active, I have been an advocate for women in ministry. And I got 2 emails this morning from women students at Tumaini saying, can you do something? Can you advocate for me? You know, that the need continues. So the alternative track that's being developed by some in Tanzania, some in South Africa, certainly some in Madagascar, but also in the RCA, has led to less progressive Christianity, a place where exclusion happens. And having listened to you this morning, I think you're doing something different. So how do we keep a place for inclusion as part of what it means to follow Jesus in a Lutheran way? Thank you very much.
Amen. Thank you for your question. And I have to be honest with you that I have not studied global Lutheranism in a way to feel like that I can give a response that might talk about solutions. Here's some things that I will say that the Missouri Synod Church was present and at one of the events at the Central Diocese when I was there. It's a unique, complicated relationship, but here's what I know. When I touched down in South Africa, Liberia, Rwanda, and I show that blue passport, it comes with a certain level of privilege that even I don't get to recognize or realize here. And I know that I would be using that privilege in the wrong way if I went and suggested to another country how they might be organizing themselves. My call is to lift up what we are doing here in our values and things that are central to us. Last year, I was able to be a part of a celebration at 2 a.m. where the first presiding bishop in South Africa for the Lutheran Church is a woman. And I know it's got to be a struggle. I know it's got to be difficult. But I still celebrated at 2 a.m. I did my best through my typing features to let it be known that their companions here were celebrating. So the alternate track in which I speak about, I need us to know that this alternate track isn't new. When the predecessor bodies came together, they did a study to look at what each body was doing, and it was a culmination. So for as long as there's been Lutheranism, there have been these different ways of get to the same result. So it formulated when the ELCA was formed to the team process. But bits and pieces of this has already existed in the predecessor bodies. So the point I would make is that while I'm talking about this track, it isn't new to American Lutheranism. Thank you for your question. Y'all doing better. I see y'all hands.
Good morning, and thank you, Bishop. I'm Sandra Quick, and my first question is really easy. What was your covenant scripture? Luke 5, I don't have my glasses on. Luke 5 what?
You said what was the scripture?
Yeah.
Luke 13, 1 to 9. The parable is in 6 to 9. But I knew I was at a seminary and some student would say, well, what was before verse 6? So I included verse 1 to 9 in my preaching. See, I've been to seminary before. Amen.
I'm going to piggyback on her question, and it has to do with BIPOC. Okay. And so how is the seminary, the Lutheran Seminary, the Lutheran team approach, the Lutheran SAM approach, helping the new folks that are going in to be culturally competent and culturally congruent, not even competent, but culturally congruent with congregations, if they're all white? So this is white to white, because there's more white than anything else. So where is the training for those who are coming out of any one of these programs to be culturally congruent?
Thank you for your question, and I hope it's okay if I answer it from my context. I do think you lift up great things, and I've heard from the leaders at this place a willingness to listen but also act. And so I'm glad we've set those questions here. The work is not just the seminaries, but it's also mine. So I take that as a question to me and to all bishops to do better. And I want you to know that I hear that, I agree with it. And what we are doing, it's taken us 2 years into my administration, but diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lady by the name of Reverend Sunita Mortha is leading it up from my office. One of the first things we're developing are these modules. Modules that you can click on and see, but also that staff can transport into your community. One of the communities, and again, don't pay attention to the name, but I want you to understand the method is what has been referred to as a white ally group that is trained by Sunita in all of these modules. So these leaders have come forward and said, I want to be involved. How do I help you now take this into our communities? Because we are sending these leaders to the seminary, right? So I see a lot of this as being my work, but the seminaries are also our partners. So until I can find, it's 2 years of work. And for many people, it looks like you've been talking about this for 2 years, but we've been doing the work. But that's the method that I intend on using to answer your call for accountability through our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Office. And I think she referred to it as diversity, inclusion, and belonging. So she refers to it as DIBS. Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much for your sermon last night. You definitely worked the text. And I must say that I appreciate the 1 more year, but it was also very convicting. So here's my question. You showed younger people on the screen. You talked about Catherine. My imagination, I assumed she was a bit older. You also talked about Stephen. My imagination told me he was a bit younger. With that being said, can you give insight to how a younger person can make headway, and I'm Baptist, by the way. Can you give insight to how a younger person can make headway in a congregation that's older and that has maybe the congregation has lost their zeal and community impact?
I hope y'all invite me back. Like, these are their questions. Amen. So someone asked this question about traditional service and contemporary service, right? And I really do think that in Otis Moss' book, Blue Note Preaching, he also talks about the digital versus the analog, right? There are these, what do you do about it? So to answer your question, and this is what I've recommended to so many people, I'm not into trying to transform a community that's been worshiping a certain way for 150 years. I'm interested in that community empowering me, going back to one of the previous slides, to start something new in their midst. If you go to Unity Lutheran and Unidad, the Lady Maria, who was a social worker, that community empowered Maria to start a new ministry in their church using the same name. Unity has always just been a mission. Unidad has always been a mission of unity. And so I like the way they did it, because there's a certain way of worship. There's a certain history, right? So this idea that all of a sudden all you got to do is get you some young people and bring them into a church, and then all of a sudden, I find that very, very difficult. The benefit I had with the Shekinah Chapel started out that way. So sometimes people would come to our service when I was leading and say, how do we do that? I think you have to do it in the midst of a structure. So my recommendation is always try to start another service, another ministry, another something, because any leader attracts folks who think like them, right? And so when you're building something, those who say I want in typically have a similar way of thinking. So that's really what I would do. That's what I recommend, and it's what I promote, doing something even within the structure that is new.